Hey, it's Terry with Something Spooky. I'm here to talk about my favorite horror movies of the year 2020. This list was published back in October and it hasn't changed, but I'm going to go into more detail and just kind of go through it again with all my favorite horror movies that came out this year. I'm also going to say right off the bat that a lot of these movies, some of them technically released in 2019 at film festivals and that kind of thing, but they all released to the public this year, 2020. A lot of them digitally, of course, not many things made it to theaters. But a lot of these movies, even if their technical release date was 2019, 2020 was the first chance that most of us got to see them. So that's what we're going off of. I also want to say that, it's been a while since I've done a video like this, so thank you for sticking with the channel, and I hope you are doing well, you watching this. So let's get right into the top 10 horror movies of the year, according to Something Spooky. Okay, number 10 is Amulet, and this is kind of a weird way to start things off because it's pretty obscure, and it is a British horror movie that released in film festivals and the such, but you can find it now on Amazon Prime. You can rent it, and it is described as a feminist horror movie, so you'll have to decide if that's your speed, and it's very slow and stylistic, so it's not going to be for everybody, but I was really impressed with it. It's not perfect all the way throughout. There are some weird pacing issues and that kind of thing, but ultimately it crafts a vision that is pretty unique, and it has some very enduring imagery, and like I said, it has those real clear messages as to what it is delivering. I'll also use this opportunity to talk about something that's not on my list, which may be a surprise, and that's Relic, which was a big movie for 2020, a lot of people's horror movie of the year. And I did like Relic, but I was not as impressed with it as everybody else. And between the two, because I think there are some similarities between Relic and Amulet in the way that they are kind of paced and what they're trying to do, I would prefer Amulet. But nod to Relic 2, which is also a horror movie obviously worth seeing and one of the most popular of the year. Number 9 is I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Charlie Kaufman. And this is, again, it's kind of like the last movie in that it's slow and surreal and just not going to be everybody's cup of tea. It was almost too much for me even because it was very long. And while I was enjoying it, the longer it is and the more kind of incomprehensible it is, by the end, you're kind of just adrift on the ocean with this movie. But it's still really amazing, and if you do like slow burn horror, it's one of the best of the year. If you don't, like I said, it's not going to be your thing, but it is very well made. It is a beautiful film. It does some really interesting things with like poetry and kind of inner monologue. It's really interesting, and if it sounds like something you'd be interested in, it's worth checking out. But if it doesn't, then you're probably not going to like it, and it's on Netflix. Which, number 8, the next movie on the list, is also a Netflix exclusive, and that's The Babysitter Killer Queen. I love the first Babysitter. I think it's great. It's really funny. It's a modern horror classic, maybe. I think it's going to endure pretty well. This one is good. It doesn't quite live up to the first one, but as far as horror movie sequels go, it could be worse. One of my biggest problems with it is that it's a little too self-referential to the first movie. There's a lot of like winking and nodding about like, oh, you remember this from the first movie? And, that's cool, but it kind of takes it too far. And especially if you hadn't seen the first movie or like didn't hold it in, such regard or remember it, then it's kind of lost on you. And I feel like the second movie should have tried to make its own identity a little bit more than it did. But it still is fun. It's still action-packed for a horror movie. It's, kind of explosive and charming in a way. So I still really liked it. It just didn't quite rise to the heights of the first movie. Number 7 was Nocturne. And this is one of the Blumhouse videos that were produced for Amazon Prime. It's kind of a gripping thriller. It's one of those movies that maybe some people would say is not straight horror because a lot of it's kind of slow and just playing with bad emotions and tension. But it does culminate in some real horrific stuff too. I really liked it. I was impressed with it. I thought it was an interesting story. It's about this apprentice, this kind of prodigy musician who is jealous of her sister. And, of course, all this evil, kind of supernatural stuff gets involved. But just that premise, I thought it was an interesting setup. And it was definitely my favorite of those Blumhouse Prime movies. So it's worth checking out. It was pretty solid. It's not amazing, but I liked it. Number 6 is The Rental. And that's Dave Franco, James Franco's brother's directorial debut. And I was really impressed with The Rental. I wasn't sure quite what to make of it. I almost didn't, go out of my way to watch it, but I'm really glad that I did. And I think it's easily one of the most kind of accessible horror movies of the year. It's a pretty traditional horror movie in some ways. It kind of plays on like the slasher A little bit of the home invasion angle, not really. It's about like an Airbnb that people are renting, hence the name, the rental. And it's a bit of a mystery kind of like tension thing again, but it's more straight horror too. And there are definitely kind of those big, clean horror tropes. And just the ending, just like the end credit scene, like if you don't watch anything else, maybe it wouldn't hit you the same if you didn't see the movie, but like the way they kind of play the premise of the rental is really interesting, and it's a very modern horror story. It was good, and it's a good looking movie too. Number 5 is The Beach House. This is on Shudder, and it is a mind trip. It is a very, very strange movie. It's pretty grotesque at parts. There's some serious gore and kind of body horror stuff more than I normally get into, but it's done well here, and their characters really make it all matter more than it normally does. It doesn't seem like it's just gore for gore's sake. It's like you're on this ride with these characters, and what happens to them sometimes is not pleasant, but it's all kind of in service to what the story is doing, which is all very interesting. And again, it is a very good looking movie outside of being an ugly, grotesque movie at points, but it's also very scenic on the beach house, the whole kind of premise of that. And it just goes in these really mind-bending directions that I did not see coming at all. Number 4 is Color Out of Space, and this is starring Nicolas Cage. I think this is actually the best cinematic adaptation of a Lovecraft story ever that I've seen, and I've tried to seek a lot of them out. I, of course, love some of the older ones, and this one isn't a straight adaptation either. It takes a lot of liberties, but it's really, really good, and I really liked how it kind of played into things like elements of The Thing, that kind of weird monster horror was really interesting in this movie. Again, I've said it a lot, but this is a great looking movie. It's just very visually based. There's a lot of colors, into the name. It's all just very kind of deliberate in the way things are paced and framed. Nicolas Cage is Nicolas Cage, and he's just all over the place in this movie. It's one of his most wild performances in a while. It's more the trademark Nicolas Cage, what you expect for him when he seems a little unhinged, and there are parts where he's just dominating the set. But it makes it interesting, and kind of something that I've always said about this is like, if you can imagine Nicolas Cage and Tommy Chong in a like art house Lovecraft movie, that's what you're getting, and it's a trip. It's something worth seeing. Number 3 is Host. Host blew me away. This is on Shudder. It is the pandemic horror film that was shot entirely in Zoom. It's really groundbreaking. It's a story, of course, unique to our year, everything that we've gone through. It speaks to those concerns, those anxieties more than anything else this year. It was produced during the pandemic, of course, with these pandemic means. It has a really interesting production story if you want to kind of read about how they managed to do this and make the whole movie in Zoom. But beyond that, it's just really good. It's still just really well done. It's not just a gimmick. It works for what it's doing, but for me, it actually kind of delivered what Paranormal Activity always wanted to do, and I like the Paranormal Activity movies fine, but it takes this perspective and this kind of new way of telling this classic ghost story and makes it applicable to us in our modern kind of vernacular. But it is really good beyond just that premise. It's also just a good ghost story. It's also just pretty creepy and well done. I liked that it was short. It's like just under an hour long. I kind of wish things were a little more flexible in time, and this one kind of felt like it was just as long as it needed to be. It just did what it needed to do, and it was kind of the perfect ghost story for our year. And that's part of what horror does, is speak to our concerns and anxieties and problems and tragedies in the world. Number 2 is The Lodge. The Lodge blows me away. I don't understand why it doesn't get more love. I think it's one of the most underrated horror movies, certainly of the last few years. It's slow burn horror, so it's not going to be everybody's thing. But if you liked movies like, Hereditary or The Witch or whatever, The Lodge, I think, is the best thing like that we got this year. It is very, very cruel. It's just a dark, grim movie. There's really hardly any light to it at all. So it's not an easy watch, but it is just beautiful and horrific, and it is unique this year, I think, in how well it is able to execute that vision of this slow-paced, really, elaborately paced horror that really just builds to itself in a culminative way that by the end you're just left feeling a little shook. And the number one horror movie of the year for something spooky is The Invisible Man. And The Invisible Man, to me, is pretty much everything that a horror movie needs to be. It's not saying that it's perfect, but it was the best movie for me this year in that it delivered a lot of things that I love about classic horror, monsters, in the kind of classic monster horror movie pace and almost like an action movie at points. But it was also thoughtful and beautiful in the way that these slow burn horror movies can be. It still had that element. It's very visually appealing. I love the soundtrack. It does have some cool themes and messages with like abuse and online harassment that you can look into and kind of read into. But it's also just a really entertaining movie. It's like a blockbuster. And with the way this year went, there are a lot of horror movies that probably would have been on this list, almost certainly would have been on this list, that weren't released, like Halloween Kills and Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, and more that didn't get released this year. They got pushed back because of everything going on. And since The Invisible Man came at the beginning of the year, I believe it was January, it might have been February, it's one of the only big budget, huge horror movies to get released this year. And so I've thought a lot about how it's interesting that it's my favorite horror movie of the year, because that's not always the case. It's not like the big budget, Hollywood movies are always the best horror movies of the year. And a lot of the ones on my list weren't that. But The Invisible Man prevailed over them, and being the only kind of big budget movie like that this year, I thought it was interesting. But it's in part because it still captures the spirit of what's been happening in horror the last few years, I think. It is a big, Hollywood production with some action movies and some silly action moments and silly plot holes and stuff. But it also really seems to kind of be in touch to where horror is at for a lot of us in the genre right now, watching these new masterpieces get released, and it delivered on that side of it too. The Invisible Man is, I think, a horror movie for our time, 2020. It is a kind of relevant movie in some ways. And I think it's also like a horror movie that will just hold up on its own through time as an entertaining monster movie, if nothing else, which is, of course, a weakness of mine. So I hope this helped. I will be posting alongside it. You can find a lot of these movies online. I think you can find all of them online. You can find most of them free. Some of them you have to rent, but I'll post where you can find them. Hopefully this helps you find some new stuff that maybe you haven't checked out yet. It was good to do another video like this. Stay tuned to Something Spooky for more. Thanks.